Mountain Man found a girl, living in his walls. Her first words stunned him. It begins on a frozen night, high in the mountains, when a weary woodsman hears scratching inside his cabin walls, and tears open the boards to find a terrified woman hiding in the dark. She's thin as winter and shaking so hard the lantern rattles. Then she whispers the words that freeze him in place. "Don't let him find me." But the danger outside isn't just any man. A trapper rides the valleys with a paper claiming he owns her, backed by a law twisted against the powerless. As snowstorms close in and hoofbeats echo through the pines, the woodsman must choose between the silent life he knows and the fight he fears he'll lose. Because the woman is hiding more than sorrow, and the man hunting her has secrets buried deeper than the snow. What truth forced her into the walls of a stranger's cabin? And will he risk everything when the trapper finally comes knocking? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wooden spoon scraped against the bottom of Owen Cooper's tin plate, the sound echoing in his empty cabin. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls as evening settled over the mountains. He'd eaten the last of his bean stew alone, same as always, though something felt different tonight. His eyes drifted to the flour sack in the corner. It sat lighter than it should, the fabric slumped in a way that made his forehead crease. The salt jar on his shelf wasn't where he'd left it either, shifted just slightly to the left. Little things most folks might miss, but Owen had spent too many years tracking to ignore such details. He set his plate aside, the tin clicking against the wooden table. The lamp flame wavered, sending shadows skittering across the floorboards. That's when he heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from deep within the log wall behind his bunk. Owen went still, listening. His first thought was mice. Winter always drove the creatures indoors, seeking warmth. But this sound was different, too irregular, too careful. It reminded him of the stories the locals told about pine spirits, the restless souls they claimed wandered these mountains. Owen had always dismissed such tales as nonsense, but in the growing darkness, the scratching seemed almost deliberate. Rising slowly from his chair, Owen moved closer to the wall. The rough bark of the logs pressed against his ear as he listened. The scratching had stopped, but then his breath caught in his throat, a whimper. Soft, muffled, but unmistakably human. His heart hammered against his ribs. Owen's hands trembled slightly as he lit a second lamp, holding it close to the wall. The logs showed no obvious gaps or holes, but the sound had been real. He set the lamp down and retrieved his hatchet from beside the woodpile, its familiar weight steady in his grip. "Hello?" he called softly, not wanting to frighten whoever, or whatever, was in there. No response came, but he heard movement, a shifting in the darkness beyond the logs. Owen examined the wall carefully, finding a section where the chinking between the logs seemed fresher than the rest. Working slowly, methodically, he began to pry at one of the boards. The wood groaned in protest as he worked the hatchet's blade beneath it. With a final heave, the plank came loose. The lamp's glow penetrated the narrow space revealed behind the wall. Owen's breath caught in his throat. Curled into a tight ball in the dusty darkness was a woman. Her clothes were filthy, her skin pale from lack of sun. She looked to be in her late 20s, but fear had carved lines of exhaustion into her face. Her eyes were wild, darting between Owen and the open space behind him like a trapped animal seeking escape. Owen slowly set the hatchet down, keeping his movements careful and deliberate. "It's all right," he said, his voice gentle as he might use with a spooked horse. "I won't hurt you." He extended his hand, palm up, but she pressed herself further into the wall's shadows, flinching from his gesture as if expecting a blow. The reaction made his stomach twist. He recognized that kind of fear, had seen it before in people who'd endured too much at the hands of others. The woman's throat worked as she tried to speak. When words finally came, they were barely more than a whisper, her voice cracked and raw from thirst. "Don't let him find me." The desperate plea hit Owen like a physical blow. 4 simple words that carried volumes of terror and trust he wasn't sure he deserved. But in that moment, looking at her huddled in the darkness, he knew he couldn't turn away. "Nobody's going to find you here," he assured her, keeping his voice low and steady. "You're safe." He wasn't sure if the words were true, but he meant them with every fiber of his being. Moving slowly, he reached for the wool blanket on his bunk. "May I?" he asked, holding it out to her. She watched him warily but gave a tiny nod. With infinite care, he draped the blanket around her shoulders, noting how she clutched it close, like armor against the world. "The fire's warm," he said, gesturing to the hearth. "Would you like to come sit closer to it?" He didn't reach for her, didn't try to hurry her, just waited, giving her the space to choose. Several long moments passed before she began to move, uncurling herself from the tight space with painful slowness. Owen stepped back, giving her a clear path to the fire. She moved like someone expecting to be struck, each step cautious and measured. The firelight revealed more details as she emerged fully from the wall. Her dark hair was tangled and matted, her clothes torn and stained. She had the high cheekbones and copper skin that spoke of Apache heritage, though fear had leached much of the color from her face. What caught Owen's attention most were her eyes, deep brown and intelligent, watching everything with sharp awareness despite her exhaustion. She settled near the hearth, careful to keep the table between herself and Owen. The blanket was wrapped tight around her shoulders, but he could see her trembling beneath it. Whether from cold, fear, or both, he couldn't tell. The gap in the wall gaped behind them like an open wound, letting in fingers of the night air. Through the cabin's window, Owen could see darkness settling over the mountains, thick and heavy as a burial shroud. He knew he should fix the wall, but that could wait. Right now, the woman before him needed help more than his cabin needed repairs. "I've got some water here," he said, moving slowly to retrieve a cup. "And there's stew left if you're hungry." He kept his movements deliberate and telegraphed, trying to show he meant no threat. She watched him with those sharp eyes as he filled a tin cup with water from his barrel. When he set it on the table and stepped back, she reached for it with trembling hands. The way she drank, desperate but careful, told him she'd gone thirsty before, knew the dangers of drinking too fast after going without. While she drank, Owen stirred up the fire, adding another log. The flames cast warm light across the cabin's single room, pushing back the shadows that pressed against the windows. Outside, an owl called, its lonely voice carrying through the winter night. The woman lowered the empty cup, her throat working as she swallowed. When she spoke again, her voice was slightly stronger, though still rough. "Thank you." The words seemed to cost her something, as if gratitude was a luxury she'd learned to live without. Owen nodded, settling into his chair at a respectful distance. "You're welcome to the stew as well," he said, gesturing to the pot still warming by the fire. "Don't reckon you're the one who's been at my flour and salt these past few days?" A flash of fear crossed her face, but she lifted her chin slightly. "I'll pay you back," she said, the words carrying a dignity that transcended her current state. "When I can." "No need," Owen assured her quickly. "There's plenty to share." He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "Been hiding in there long?" She glanced at the wall, then back to him. 3 days, she admitted. "Found the loose boards while you were out hunting. I'm sorry for taking your food, but I was—" She trailed off, but Owen could fill in the rest. Desperate, starving, afraid. "You did what you had to do to survive," he said simply. No shame in that. He'd seen enough of the world to know sometimes survival didn't leave room for niceties like asking permission. The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks. The woman flinched at the sound, then tried to hide it by pulling the blanket closer. Owen pretended not to notice, giving her what dignity he could. "I'm Owen Cooper," he offered, figuring she should know the name of the man whose cabin she'd taken shelter in. "This here's my place, such as it is. You're welcome to stay until you're stronger." He kept his tone casual, trying to make it clear there were no strings attached to the offer. She was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those watchful eyes. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lydia." Just the one word, no family name offered, but it was more trust than he'd expected. Owen nodded, accepting the introduction for what it was. "Well, Lydia, why don't I fix you a bowl of that stew? Then maybe we can see about making you a proper place to sleep that isn't inside my wall." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. There and gone so quick he might have imagined it. But she nodded, some of the tension easing from her shoulders as the fire's warmth began to reach her. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the pine boughs. The wall gap let in a draft that made the lamp flames dance, but Owen paid it no mind. Instead, he focused on ladling out a bowl of stew, his movements slow and measured as he set it on the table where Lydia could reach it. Questions pressed at his mind: who she was running from, what had driven her to hide in his wall, why she looked at the world like it might bite at any moment. But those could wait. For now, he would offer what he could: warm food, a safe place to rest, and the dignity of asking nothing in return. The night deepened around the cabin as Lydia began to eat, her movements careful and controlled despite her obvious hunger. Owen settled back in his chair, watching the fire dance in the hearth. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight, at least, he could make sure one soul in this hard world had a moment's peace. The fire popped and crackled, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Lydia huddled deeper into Owen's wool blanket, her thin frame barely filling his sturdy wooden chair. Every groan of the settling logs made her shoulders tense, her dark eyes darting to each new sound like a deer catching wind of a predator. Owen moved with deliberate slowness as he stirred the pot of broth warming over the fire. Steam rose in delicate wisps, carrying the rich scent of beef and herbs through the cabin. He kept his movements steady and predictable, like he might around a spooked horse. "Reckon you could use something warm in your belly," he said softly, ladling the broth into a tin cup. He set it on the table and stepped back, giving her space. "It ain't much, but it'll help." Lydia's hands trembled as she reached for the cup, but her grip was sure. She sipped carefully, letting the warmth seep into her cold, numbed fingers. Owen settled onto his wooden stool, keeping the width of the hearth between them. "Been hiding long?" he asked, his voice gentle as morning mist. She lowered the cup slightly, her eyes meeting his for just a moment before skittering away. 3 days, she whispered. "When you'd go hunting, I'd take just enough to keep going." Her voice carried shame at the admission. "No need to fret about that," Owen said. "Food's meant for sharing." He studied her in the firelight, noting how her cheekbones stood sharp against her thin face. Her clothes hung loose on her frame, and dark circles ringed her eyes like bruises. She looked so young, barely more than a girl, really, though something in those wary eyes spoke of harder years than her appearance suggested. "You hurt anywhere?" he asked, keeping his tone matter-of-fact. "Besides being hungry and cold?" She shook her head, then seemed to reconsider. "Just tired, and sore from—" She gestured vaguely at the wall where she'd been hiding. Owen nodded. "That can't have been comfortable." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Listen, you need proper rest. Take my bunk for what's left of the night. I'll keep watch by the fire." Panic flared in her eyes. "I can't." "You can," he said firmly but kindly, "and you should. It's warm, it's soft enough, and I give you my word I won't come near while you sleep." He gestured to his chair by the hearth. "I'll sit right here and make sure nothing troubles you." Lydia's hands tightened on the cup, her knuckles going white. She looked from Owen to the bunk and back again, weighing his words against whatever fears had driven her to hide in his wall. Finally, exhaustion seemed to win out over caution. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible above the fire's crackle. Owen watched as she made her way to the bunk, still wrapped in his blanket. She moved like someone carrying invisible wounds, each step careful and measured. When she lay down, she curled toward the wall, making herself as small as possible. The night crept by slowly. Owen kept the fire fed, its warmth pushing back against the winter chill that seeped through the cabin's logs. Every so often, he heard Lydia's breathing catch and quicken, as if dark dreams were trying to claim her, but exhaustion always pulled her back under. As the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the frost-rimed windows, Owen came to a decision. He couldn't tend to her properly here. She needed a woman's care and proper food, things his bachelor's cabin couldn't provide. There was only one person in the settlement he'd trust with something like this: Mrs. Eliza Talbot. When Lydia stirred, he had coffee brewing and the last of his biscuits warming by the fire. She sat up slowly, disorientation clear on her face before memory returned. The blanket fell around her shoulders like a shawl as she took in the gray morning light. "I need to get you to someone who can help better than I can," Owen said, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "Mrs. Talbot down in the settlement. She's the preacher's widow, been taking care of folks thereabouts for longer than I can remember." Fear flickered across Lydia's face. "I can't go to town. It's not safe." "Mrs. Talbot's place is on the edge of settlement, set back from the others, and she knows how to keep her own counsel." Owen offered her the coffee. "She's helped others before who needed to stay out of sight for a spell." Lydia wrapped her fingers around the warm cup, but didn't drink. "How far?" "Half a day's drive in the buckboard, way the snow's lying." He paused. "I know it's asking a lot of trust, but you need proper care. Real food, clean clothes, someone who knows more about healing than an old mountain man." She stared into the coffee cup, as if seeking answers in its dark surface. Finally she nodded, just once, a sharp downward jerk of her chin. Owen didn't waste time. He pulled on his heavy coat and went out to the barn, where his gelding nickered a greeting. The morning air bit at his lungs as he harnessed the horse to his old buckboard wagon. He lined the wagon bed with fresh hay and his spare blankets, making it as comfortable as he could. Back in the cabin, he found Lydia standing by the fire, still wrapped in his blanket. She'd managed a few sips of coffee and a small bite of biscuit, but anxiety had stolen her appetite. "Ready?" he asked softly. She nodded again, that same sharp movement. Owen helped her into the wagon bed, making sure she was well covered against the cold. The blankets and hay would help, but winter's grip was fierce in the mountains. The journey down the trail was slow and careful. Every jolt of the wagon made Lydia tense, though she never made a sound. Owen kept the gelding to a steady pace, picking their way through the snow-covered ruts. The cold air burned in their lungs, crisp and sharp as new broken ice. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist but bringing little warmth. Pine boughs hung heavy with snow, occasionally dropping their white burden with soft thumps. Owen found himself listening hard for any sound of pursuit, though Lydia hadn't said she was being followed. Something in the way she flinched at every unexpected noise told him enough. By late afternoon, the settlement came into view through the trees. Smoke rose from scattered chimneys, and he could hear the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. Owen guided the wagon around the edge of town, avoiding the main street with its curious eyes. Mrs. Talbot's house sat apart from the others, a neat white building with green shutters, smoke curling from its chimney like a welcome sign. The parsonage had always been set back from the settlement proper, and Mrs. Talbot had maintained that distance after her husband's passing. Owen drew the wagon to a halt by her back door. Lydia was shivering despite the blankets, her face pale with cold and fatigue. Before he could climb down, the door opened, and Mrs. Talbot herself stepped out onto her porch. She took in the scene with one swift glance. Owen's worried face, the blanket-wrapped figure in his wagon, the late hour of their arrival. Without a word, she opened her door wider and gestured them inside. "Bring her through to the kitchen," she said, her voice warm but businesslike. "The fire's good and hot in there." Owen helped Lydia down from the wagon, supporting her when her legs trembled beneath her. She leaned against him more from necessity than trust, he suspected, but it was progress from the terrified woman he'd found in his wall the night before. Mrs. Talbot's kitchen was indeed warm, the big cook stove radiating heat. She pulled out a cushioned chair close to its warmth, and Owen helped Lydia settle into it. In the better light, he could see how exhaustion had painted dark smudges under her eyes, how her cheekbones stood too sharp in her face. "Now then," Mrs. Talbot said, already moving to put a kettle on. "Let's see about getting you warm and fed, shall we?" She spoke with the calm authority that had seen her through decades of caring for the sick and troubled. "Owen, you can tell me what brought you here while I fix us all some tea." As Owen explained about finding Lydia in his cabin wall, Mrs. Talbot's face grew grave, but not surprised. She'd seen too much of life's hardships to be easily shocked. When he finished, she nodded once, decisively. "You did right bringing her here," she said. "I'll take care of her now." She turned to Lydia, her voice gentling. "You're safe here, child. We'll get you sorted out proper." Lydia looked up at Mrs. Talbot, then at Owen. Some of the terror had eased from her eyes, replaced by bone-deep weariness. "Thank you," she whispered, and Owen wasn't sure which of them she was addressing. "I'll see to the horse," he said, understanding it was time for him to step back. "Let you ladies get settled." Mrs. Talbot walked him to the door. "Come back tomorrow," she said quietly. "We'll need to talk about what's to be done." Her eyes were knowing. "Something tells me this isn't as simple as a lost traveler needing help." Owen nodded, glancing back at Lydia. She sat huddled in the chair, but some of the tension had left her shoulders in the warm kitchen. "I reckon you're right about that, Mrs. Talbot. I reckon you're right." Mrs. Eliza Talbot stood in her doorway, flour dusting her apron from the morning's baking. Her eyes widened as she took in Lydia's condition, the girl's drawn face, the way she held herself as if every movement brought pain. Without hesitation, she stepped aside and gestured them in from the bitter cold. Come in," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Let's get you by the stove where it's warm." The kitchen was cozy. fragrant with the scent of fresh bread and wood smoke. Mrs. Talbot guided Lydia to a cushioned chair near the iron cookstove, where heat radiated in steady waves. As Lydia sank into the seat, Mrs. Talbot's experienced eyes noted how the girl winced, the careful way she held her left arm. "Owen," she said, "would you be so kind as to draw some fresh water from the well? We'll need quite a bit." She turned back to Lydia, who sat rigid in the chair, eyes darting between the windows and door. "Now then, let's have a proper look at you, dear." With gentle hands, Mrs. Talbot began examining the visible marks on Lydia's face and neck. Bruises in various stages of healing mottled her skin, and half-healed welts peeked from beneath her torn sleeve. Owen returned with 2 buckets of water, setting them to warm on the stove. "There's more in the well when you need it," he said quietly. Mrs. Talbot nodded, already gathering clean cloths and soap. "Thank you, Owen. Now, if you'll excuse us, I need to tend to our guest properly." Understanding her meaning, Owen touched the brim of his hat. "I'll see about visiting 3 Pines," he said. "Might be he has something that could help." As Owen's boots clumped down the porch steps, Mrs. Talbot began heating water and laying out her supplies. She helped Lydia remove the filthy outer garments, revealing more evidence of abuse beneath. Throughout the examination, Mrs. Talbot hummed old hymns. "Amazing grace! What a friend we have in Jesus!" her voice low and soothing. "There now," she murmured, beginning to clean Lydia's wounds with warm water and gentle hands. "Let's get you feeling more human again." Lydia remained silent as Mrs. Talbot worked, but tears slipped down her cheeks when the older woman washed her hair, fingers careful around the tender spots on her scalp. The water in the basin turned dark with dirt and dried blood. "I have a nightgown that should fit you," Mrs. Talbot said, wringing out a clean cloth. "And there's a proper bed made up in the spare room. When was the last time you slept in a real bed, child?" Lydia's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't remember." Meanwhile, Owen trudged through the deepening snow toward the edge of town, where 3 Pines kept his small cabin. The elderly Cherokee herbalist's home sat apart from the settlement, backed by dense forest. Smoke curled from his chimney, carrying the sharp scent of medicinal herbs. Before Owen could knock, 3 Pines opened his door. He was a tall man, still straight-backed despite his years, with deep-set eyes that seemed to look straight through pretense to truth. He gestured Owen inside without a word. The cabin's interior was warm and dim, bundles of dried plants hanging from the rafters. 3 Pines listened without interruption as Owen explained about finding Lydia, about her injuries and terror. When Owen finished, the old man nodded once and began moving around his cabin, selecting items from his stores. Into a leather pouch, he placed small packets of herbs, some for tea to calm nightmares, others for healing salves. He added a clay jar of pale green ointment that Owen recognized as 3 Pines' prized healing balm, known throughout the territory for its effectiveness with wounds and bruises. "She carries much fear," 3 Pines said at last, his voice deep and measured. "The body's hurts will heal faster than the spirit's." He handed Owen the pouch. "These will help with both." "Much obliged," Owen said, reaching for his coin purse. 3 Pines waved away the offer of payment. "Some things are not for selling," he said simply. "Help her heal. That is payment enough." Back at the parsonage, Lydia had been cleaned, dressed in a soft flannel nightgown, and settled into the spare bedroom. Mrs. Talbot had wrapped her in warm blankets and given her willow bark tea for the pain. For the first time in weeks, Lydia slept in a real bed, her breathing evening out as exhaustion pulled her under. Mrs. Talbot sat in a rocking chair nearby, knitting and watching over her charge. When Owen returned with 3 Pines' medicines, she nodded approval at the familiar items. "Good," she said softly. "These will help. But Owen—" She set her knitting aside. "Word travels fast in small places. Tommy Jenkins was in town today and saw your wagon. People will be asking questions soon enough." Owen's jaw tightened. "I know. That's why I came back so quick. We need to figure out what's to be done." They let Lydia sleep through the afternoon and evening, waking her only to take sips of broth and more of 3 Pines' tea. The next morning she managed to eat a small bowl of porridge, speaking a few shy words of thanks to Mrs. Talbot. After breakfast, the 3 adults gathered in the kitchen to discuss Lydia's situation. Outside, heavy clouds threatened more snow. "You can't stay here long," Mrs. Talbot said gently to Lydia. "Not because I don't want you to, mind, but because it isn't safe. Too many curious eyes in town, too many questions already being asked about Owen's wagon yesterday." Lydia nodded, her fingers twisting in the borrowed shawl she wore. "I understand. I don't want to bring trouble to your door." "The cabin would be safest," Owen said. "It's remote enough, and I can protect you there until we figure out something more permanent." He looked at Mrs. Talbot. "What do you think?" The older woman considered, her fingers absently smoothing her apron. "It makes sense. Few folks venture up that way in winter, and those who do generally have the sense to mind their own business." She turned to Lydia. "Do you feel strong enough to travel? The weather's turning." Lydia straightened her shoulders. "I can manage." Mrs. Talbot nodded decisively. "Right then. Let's get you properly equipped for the cold." She disappeared into her bedroom, returning with an armload of clothing. "These were meant for the church donation box, but they'll serve you better. Good sturdy things, and warm." They helped Lydia dress in layers: woolen stockings, a thick skirt, flannel blouse, and a heavy coat that had belonged to Mrs. Talbot's late husband. The clothes were a bit large, but clean and whole. Mrs. Talbot packed a bundle of additional garments, along with 3 Pines' medicines and some basic supplies. "I'll send Owen down regular for more of what you need," she promised, pressing a Bible into Lydia's hands. "And remember, you have friends here now. You're not alone. Anymore." Lydia's eyes filled with tears as she hugged the older woman. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." Outside, the sky had grown darker, and snowflakes were beginning to swirl. Owen helped Lydia into the wagon, now padded with fresh hay and extra blankets. Mrs. Talbot stood on her porch, watching as they prepared to leave. "Take care of her, Owen Cooper," she called softly. Owen touched his hat brim. "Yes, ma'am. That I will." As they drove away from the settlement, Lydia huddled under the blankets, watching Mrs. Talbot's figure grow smaller. The first real safety she'd known in months was behind her now, but something else was growing in its place. A fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she might find a different kind of safety in the high country. The snow began falling harder as Owen guided the horses toward the mountains, toward his remote cabin where Lydia would hide until they could figure out what came next. Neither spoke much as they traveled, but the silence between them was easier now, built on shared trust and protection rather than fear. Mrs. Talbot watched until the wagon disappeared into the swirling snow. Then she went inside to pray for Lydia's healing, for Owen's protection, and for the wisdom they would all need in the days to come. Outside her window, the snow continued to fall, gradually erasing all signs of their passage. The wagon creaked up the last steep stretch toward Owen's cabin as heavy snowflakes began to fall in earnest. The horses' breath came out in thick white clouds, their hooves crunching through the gathering snow. Lydia huddled deeper into her borrowed coat, watching as the forest grew denser around them. Owen glanced at the darkening sky. "Made it just in time," he said quietly. "Storm's coming in fast." Through the swirling white, the cabin emerged like a shadow against the trees. Owen helped Lydia down from the wagon, steadying her when her legs trembled from the long ride. She was stronger after Mrs. Talbot's care, but still weak, her movements cautious and measured. "Let me get the horses settled first," Owen said, leading them toward the small barn. "Then we'll get you inside where it's warm." Lydia nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as she waited by the cabin door. The wind was picking up, driving the snow sideways now. She could barely make out Owen's figure as he quickly unharnessed the team and got them into their stalls. Inside the cabin, Owen quickly built up the fire while Lydia stood near it, warming her hands. The familiar scents of wood smoke and coffee filled the small space. Everything looked different now that she wasn't viewing it through gaps in the wall. Homier somehow, despite its simplicity. Owen straightened from the fireplace and gestured toward the far wall. "I patched it temporary-like," he said, his voice almost apologetic. "Where you were hiding." The rough boards he'd nailed over the gap stood out against the older wood. "You won't ever need to hide in there again. I promise you that." Lydia's throat tightened at his words. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The storm settled in with a vengeance, howling around the cabin's corners. Owen kept the fire well fed, and the small space stayed warm despite the cold pressing in outside. As evening deepened into night, he heated some of Mrs. Talbot's soup and sliced bread from the loaf she'd sent with them. "Not much," he said, setting a bowl before Lydia. "But it's hot." They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the crack and pop of burning wood and the constant moan of the wind. Lydia managed most of her portion, though her hands shook slightly as she held the spoon. The next morning dawned white and wild, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Owen pulled on his heavy coat. "Need to get more wood in," he said, "and water from the creek before it freezes over completely." Lydia watched from the window as he made his way through the deep snow, returning again and again with arms full of split logs. The woodpile inside grew steadily larger while the snow continued to fall. When Owen came in with 2 full water buckets, his coat crusted with ice, Lydia was at the wash basin. "Let me help somehow," she said, her voice stronger than it had been. "I can at least wash the dishes." Owen started to protest, but saw the determination in her face. She needed to feel useful, to do something normal. "Much obliged," he said instead. They fell into a careful routine over the next 2 days. Owen tended to the outdoor tasks, feeding and watering the horses, keeping the path to the barn clear enough to pass, splitting more wood when needed. Lydia moved slowly around the cabin, washing dishes, sweeping the rough wooden floor. When Owen came in one afternoon to find her mending a torn sleeve on one of his shirts, he started to tell her she didn't need to, but the peaceful concentration on her face stopped him. The lamplight cast a warm glow as evening settled in. Owen found himself studying Lydia's face as she worked, realizing with a start that she was no child as he'd first thought, but a woman probably in her late 20s. Her eyes, though, they belonged to someone much older, someone who had seen too much. That second night, after they'd finished a simple supper, Owen reached for the Bible Mrs. Talbot had given Lydia. "Would you mind if I read some?" he asked. Lydia shook her head, wrapping her fingers around a tin cup of 3 Pines' healing tea. The warmth seemed to ease something in her shoulders. Owen's voice was soft but steady as he read from Psalms, the ancient words of comfort filling the cabin. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." When he finished reading, a different sound filled the quiet, a low, melodic humming coming from Lydia. The tune was unlike anything Owen had heard before, haunting and beautiful. "That's lovely," he said when she finished. "What is it?" Lydia's fingers tightened around her cup. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the need to explain who and what she was. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "It's a song my mother used to sing. She was Apache." She forced herself to look at Owen's face, bracing for the rejection she'd seen so many times before when people learned of her heritage. Instead, she found only quiet acceptance in his eyes. "You're safe here," he said simply, and in those 3 words was a world of understanding and protection. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the storm continued its wild song, but it seemed less threatening now. Lydia moved her pallet closer to the hearth, wrapping herself in the blankets Mrs. Talbot had sent with them. Owen added another log to the fire, watching as the flames licked around it. When he glanced over at Lydia a few minutes later, she had fallen asleep, her face relaxed in a way he hadn't seen before. The fear that had been her constant companion since he'd found her seemed to have eased just a little. He settled into his chair, prepared to keep watch through another winter night. The snow fell thick and steady outside the window, but inside the cabin, something fragile and precious was beginning to take root. Trust, slowly growing in the space between 2 wounded souls. Earlier that day, while she was sweeping, Lydia had discovered one of Mrs. Talbot's shawls tucked into the bundle of clothes. Now it lay across her shoulders as she slept, its soft wool catching the firelight. Owen noticed how her hands, even in sleep, stayed close to her body, ready to protect herself. But her breathing was deep and even, free from the frightened gasps that had marked her first night in the cabin. The storm had sealed them away from the world, creating a pocket of safety where Lydia could begin to heal. Owen knew there would be questions to answer, decisions to make when the weather cleared. But for now, watching over her sleep, he was content to let the snow keep falling, building its white wall between them and whatever had driven Lydia to hide inside his walls. In the quiet hours that followed, Owen remembered 3 Pines' words about fear and healing. The old man had been right. The body's hurts were already beginning to fade, but the deeper wounds would take more time. Still, seeing Lydia's peaceful sleep, hearing her trust him with the truth of her heritage, Owen felt hope stirring. Perhaps here, in this simple cabin high in the mountains, both of them could find a measure of healing. The fire settled lower, its light softening. Owen added another log carefully, trying not to wake Lydia. She stirred slightly but didn't wake, the shawl rising and falling with her steady breathing. Outside, the storm began to ease, though the snow continued to fall, transforming the world into something clean and new. The storm finally broke on the 3rd morning, leaving behind a world draped in white silence. Owen stood at his small pantry shelf, counting supplies with a deepening frown. The flour sack felt light in his hands, barely enough for 2 more days of bread. His coffee tin rattled nearly empty, and the last of the salt pork was gone. He turned to find Lydia watching him from her seat by the fire, her dark eyes reading his expression. "We're running low, aren't we?" Owen nodded, setting the flour sack back carefully. "Need to make a supply run to town." He tried to keep his voice matter-of-fact, but saw her shoulders tense immediately. "How long?" Her fingers worked at the edge of her shawl, twisting the wool. "Half day there and back, if the trail's passable." Owen moved to the window, studying the snow-covered path that wound down the mountainside. Might take longer, depending on how deep the drifts are. Lydia stood, crossing to the window beside him. She kept a careful distance, something he'd noticed she always did, but her voice was steady. "I'll be all right here." Owen turned to face her. "There's a loft space above the main room," he said, pointing to the rough ladder that led to the small platform. "You can see the whole cabin from up there, including the door. And—" He hesitated, then continued. "My rifle's wrapped in an old blanket behind the feed sacks. Do you know how to use one?" A shadow crossed Lydia's face. "Yes," she said simply, and Owen didn't press for details. "I'll leave it loaded, just in case." He watched her nod, noting how her eyes kept darting to the door. "Nobody comes up here in winter except me, Lydia. You'll be safe." She managed a small smile, though her hands still worried at the shawl. "I know, She took a deep breath. "I'll be fine. We need supplies." Owen spent the next hour preparing for the ride. He checked his gelding's shoes, packed empty saddlebags, and made sure Lydia had enough wood stacked inside to last the day. Before leaving, he helped her position some feed sacks on the loft platform to make a comfortable watching post. "Keep the door barred," he said, pulling on his heavy coat. "I'll knock 3 times when I return, then call out." Lydia nodded from the loft, her face pale but determined. She had the rifle within easy reach, though Owen prayed she wouldn't need it. The morning air bit sharp and clean as Owen mounted up. Fresh snow crunched under his horse's hooves as they picked their way down the trail. He looked back once to see Lydia's face at the window. Then she disappeared from view as the path curved around a stand of pines. The ride took longer than usual, with Owen having to guide his horse carefully around deep drifts. By midday, he reached the town, its few buildings huddled against the cold. Smoke rose straight from chimneys in the still air. The general store bell jingled as Owen entered, stamping snow from his boots. Old Joe Barnes looked up from his ledger, nodding a greeting. "Mighty cold ride from your place, Cooper." "Trail's rough but passable." Owen began gathering what he needed. Flour, coffee beans, salt, lamp oil. He added some dried apples and a small bag of hard candy, thinking how Lydia might appreciate something sweet. The store was quiet except for the scratch of Joe's pencil and the creak of floorboards under Owen's feet. Then the door burst open, letting in a blast of cold air and a man Owen had never seen before. The stranger filled the doorframe, tall, broad-shouldered, with a tangled dark beard and eyes that reminded Owen of a hungry wolf. His buckskins were trail-worn, and a heavy knife hung at his belt. The man's gaze swept the store, settling on Owen with unsettling intensity. "Name's Silas Goff," he announced to the room at large, his voice rough as creek gravel. "Looking for something that belongs to me." Owen kept his face carefully blank as he continued gathering supplies. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands remained steady. Goff reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, creased and dirty from long carrying. He smoothed it against the counter, and Owen caught a glimpse of official-looking writing. "Woman run off from me 2 weeks back," Goff said, tapping the paper. "Got the contract right here, bought and paid for fair and square." His mouth twisted in what might have been meant as a smile. "Half-breed Apache," answers to Lydia. "Anyone seen her passing through?" The silence in the store grew thick. Owen could feel Joe Barnes's eyes on him as he set his items on the counter, forcing himself to move naturally. "Ain't seen no women traveling alone," Joe said finally. "Weather's been too fierce for that." Goff's eyes narrowed. "She's mine by law. Paper's got the territorial judge's seal and everything." He looked directly at Owen again, You live up in them hills, don't you? Seen any tracks around your place?" Owen counted out coins for his purchases, grateful his hands weren't shaking. "Nothing but deer and rabbit sign," he said evenly. "Storms kept everything else away." Goff studied him a moment longer, then turned back to Joe. "I'll be staying at the boarding house for a few days. Weather breaks proper. I mean to do some looking around. Anyone sees her, there's money in it." He pushed through the door, letting in another gust of cold air. Owen finished his transaction as quickly as he could without appearing rushed, though his chest felt tight with urgency. Outside, he secured his supplies with hands that finally betrayed their trembling. The sun was already swinging west. He'd lost too much time. He mounted up and turned toward home, pushing his horse faster than was wise on the snowy trail. Dusk was gathering by the time he reached the cabin, shadows stretching long across the unmarked snow. He dismounted stiffly, his body aching from the hard ride. "Lydia," he called after knocking 3 times. "It's Owen." He heard the bar lift, and then she was there, relief washing over her face. But it vanished as soon as she saw his expression. "He's in town, isn't he?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Owen nodded, closing the door firmly behind him. "Silas Goff. He has some kind of contract he claims gives him ownership of you." He watched the color drain from her face. "Lydia, did he really?" "No!" The word burst from her like it had been torn loose. The paper's a lie. The soldier who first took me, he sold me to Goff, but there was never any legal contract. Goff must have forged one." Her hands were shaking now. "He's evil, Owen. The things he did." She wrapped her arms around herself, and Owen had to fight down a surge of fury at whatever this man had done to put such terror in her eyes. "He's staying in town," Owen said quietly. "Says he means to search the area when the weather clears." Lydia sank into the chair by the fire, her legs seeming to give out. "He won't stop looking," she whispered. "He thinks he owns me." Owen began unpacking the supplies, his mind racing. They needed a plan. But for now, Lydia looked close to breaking. He pulled out the small bag of candy and set it beside her. "We'll figure something out," he said, trying to put more confidence in his voice than he felt. "But first, you need to eat something, and I reckon we could both use a cup of coffee." He busied himself with the stove, giving Lydia time to collect herself. But his thoughts kept circling back to Goff's cold eyes and that fraudulent contract. The threat was no longer nebulous. It had a name and a face, and it was waiting in town, less than half a day's ride away. As darkness settled outside, Owen added wood to the fire. The cabin felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress that needed defending. He watched Lydia's tense form in the firelight, knowing that whatever came next, he couldn't let Goff find her. The question was, how far would he have to go to prevent it? Owen slid the heavy wooden bar across the door, testing its strength with a firm push. The familiar cabin suddenly felt exposed, every gap between the logs a potential betrayal. He moved to the fireplace and carefully arranged the logs, banking them low so their glow wouldn't shine through any cracks to the darkness outside. Lydia sat huddled in Mrs. Talbot's borrowed shawl, her face ghost-pale in the dimming light. Her eyes followed Owen's movements as he settled onto the bench across from her. "I need to tell you exactly what I saw in town," Owen said quietly, "so you'll know what we're facing." Lydia's fingers tightened in the wool of the shawl, but she nodded. "He's tall, broad-shouldered, dark beard, tangled and wild. Moves like a hunter." Owen kept his voice steady, clinical. "His buckskins are trail-worn, and he carries a big knife on his belt. But it's his eyes that mark him, cold as a winter creek, watching everything like prey." Like a wolf, Lydia whispered. That's what I always thought. A wolf in man's clothing. He showed everyone a paper, Owen continued. Said it was a contract of ownership, claimed it bore the territorial judge's seal. At the name Goff, Lydia doubled over as if struck, arms wrapped tight around her middle. A sound escaped her, half groan and half whimper, that made Owen's chest ache. You're safe here, he said softly. He doesn't know where to look. Minutes passed before Lydia could straighten again. The fire popped and settled, sending shadows dancing across her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin but determined. The paper is a lie, she said. There was never any real contract. But Goff... She swallowed hard. He wasn't the first one to claim he owned me. Owen waited, letting her find her way through the words at her own pace. Outside, wind sighed through the pines. There was a soldier at Fort Mason, Lydia continued. He gambled away more than he could pay. Goff held his markers. Her hands trembled as she pulled the shawl tighter. The soldier, he said I was payment enough for the debt. Just grabbed me one night and handed me over like I was a horse or a saddle. Anger flared hot in Owen's gut. This soldier, what did he look like? Tall and lean, yellow hair, usually needed cutting. Had a scar here. She touched her jaw. From a knife fight, he said. Always bragging about riding with the scouts, raiding Apache camps. Her voice caught. He knew what I was, part Apache. Said that made me less than nothing. The description hit Owen like a physical blow. Memory rushed in, yellow hair falling in eyes that never quite met yours straight on. That perpetual smirk, the endless cruel jokes around campaign fires. Jenkins. Timothy Jenkins. Owen's hands clenched into fists on the table. He'd ridden with Jenkins, watched him swagger through frontier posts, listened to his stories of raids that were more like massacres, and said nothing. Done nothing. The soldier, Owen forced out. Did he favor his left leg? Walk with a slight limp? Lydia's head snapped up, eyes suddenly sharp with fear. You know him? Knew him. Owen's voice was rough with shame. I rode with the scouts 2 years back. Jenkins was... I saw what kind of man he was, the things he'd laugh about. But I never spoke against him, never tried to stop him. The confession felt like stones in his throat. I just looked away. Lydia stared at him, body tensing as if ready to bolt. The fear in her eyes cut Owen deeper than any knife. I'm not that man anymore, he said quietly. Haven't been for a long time. But my silence back then. It helped men like Jenkins think they could do whatever they wanted. What happened to you? His voice cracked. I might as well have handed you to him myself. You didn't know, Lydia whispered, but her eyes were still wary. I knew enough, Owen said. I knew he was evil and I did nothing. That's its own kind of guilt. Hours crept by as Lydia gradually told more of her story. How Jenkins had grabbed her from the laundry where she worked at the fort. How Goff had treated her like a possession. How she'd finally managed to slip away during a storm and run blindly into the mountains. Owen listened, each word another weight on his conscience. The fire burned lower. Lydia's voice grew hoarse, then fell silent. She curled up beside the hearth, wrapped in the shawl, exhaustion finally pulling her under. Her face in sleep looked younger, more vulnerable, and Owen's guilt twisted sharper. He sat at the table long into the night, head in his hands, remembering Jenkins's lazy drawl as he described dealing with savages, the way other men would laugh along, how Owen had just stared into his coffee cup and said nothing. The memories tasted like ashes. Near midnight, Owen rose stiffly and checked the door's bar one more time. The cabin was cold now, the fire barely glowing. He took a breath of the chill air and blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Lord, he whispered, the word feeling strange in his mouth. He hadn't prayed since he was a boy. If you're listening, help me make this right. Please. Only the wind answered, sighing through the trees outside. In the dark, Owen listened to Lydia's quiet breathing and silently renewed his promise to protect her, not from duty or pity, but as the first step toward redemption for his long-ago cowardice. The night pressed close around the cabin, full of memories and regret. But somewhere in the darkness, Owen felt a spark of hope, not for forgiveness, perhaps, but for the chance to finally stand against the evil he had once ignored. This time, he would not look away. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the frost-covered pines in shades of pewter and pearl. Inside the cabin, Owen stirred the breakfast fire to life, while Lydia wrapped herself tighter in her blanket, both of them moving through the familiar morning routine with added wariness. Owen set a pot of coffee to boil and turned to face Lydia. "We need to talk about Silas," he said quietly. "He won't just give up and move on. Men like him, they don't let go of what they think belongs to them." Lydia's shoulders tensed, but she nodded. "I know." "I'm thinking to ride into town today," Owen continued, measuring his words carefully. "Need to talk to Mrs. Talbot in Three Pines, maybe even the marshal." He paused, watching her face. "Word is Silas heads out to check his trap lines most mornings. I'll time it when he's gone." "What if—" Lydia swallowed hard. "What if the marshal believes his paper?" "Then we'll figure something else out," Owen said firmly. "I ain't letting him take you back. That's a promise." After a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush, Owen helped Lydia into the cabin's small loft. She'd sleep there while he was gone, with his Winchester close at hand. The familiar weight of his revolver settled at his hip as he prepared to leave. "Bar the door behind me," he instructed. "Don't open it for nobody but me. I'll knock 3 times, pause, then twice more." Lydia's face was pale but determined as she nodded. The sound of the door bar sliding into place followed Owen out into the crisp morning air. The ride to town seemed longer than usual, every cracking twig making him tense. But the trail remained empty, and by mid-morning, he was tying his horse outside Mrs. Talbot's parsonage. The widow opened her door at his knock, her shrewd eyes taking in his troubled expression. "Come in," she said simply. "I'll put on fresh coffee." In her warm kitchen, Owen laid out everything: Lydia's story, Silas's contract, and the crushing weight of his own guilt about Jenkins. His voice grew hoarse as he described his years of silence while riding with the scouts, how his cowardice had helped men like Jenkins believe they could treat people as property. Mrs. Talbot listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she rose and walked to her door, scanning the street before heading to Three Pines' cabin. The elderly Cherokee healer joined them minutes later, settling into a chair with deliberate grace. "The law may see only paper," Three Pines said after hearing Owen's account, "but the Creator sees truth." His dark eyes held centuries of wisdom. "A contract built on evil has no real power." Mrs. Talbot nodded. "My late husband always said law without justice is just another kind of violence." She straightened her spine. "The girl needs defenders who'll stand in the light of truth, not hide behind false papers." "The marshal might not see it that way," Owen warned. "Then we'll have to help him see clearer," Mrs. Talbot said firmly. "Go talk to him. We'll pray while you do." The marshal's office was cool and shadowed when Owen entered that afternoon. The lawman sat behind his desk, a telegraph form in his hands, his face impassive as Owen explained the situation. "Papers speak louder than stories," the marshal said finally, setting down the telegram. "If Goff's contract bears a territorial judge's seal—" He shook his head. "My hands might be tied here, Cooper. Law's the law." "Even when the law's being twisted to hurt an innocent?" Owen challenged. The marshal's expression didn't change. Especially then. Otherwise, it's just men deciding what's right based on feeling. That's not justice. That's chaos. He sighed. I'm sorry about the girl, truly. But unless you can prove that contract's false, I got to treat it as binding. Owen rode back to his cabin with a heavy heart, the sun already sliding toward the mountains. Inside, Lydia listened quietly as he related the marshal's words. Her hands trembled, but her voice stayed steady. I won't go back to him, she said softly. I'd rather— It won't come to that, Owen cut in. Mrs. Talbot and 3 Pines are with us. We'll find a way. The next day dawned warmer, hints of thaw in the air. Mid-morning brought the crunch of wagon wheels, Mrs. Talbot and 3 Pines arriving with baskets of herbs and bread. Owen watched from the doorway as they settled around his rough table with Lydia. Talbot laid out 3 Pines' healing supplies, small cloth bags of dried plants, jars of salve, bundles of sweet grass. Her movements were unhurried as she took Lydia's hands, turning them gently to examine the fading bruises on her wrists. The Lord sees every sparrow that falls, Mrs. Talbot murmured, smoothing healing salve over the marks. He sees you too, child, sees the truth of what was done to you. 3 Pines nodded, adding his own herbs to the salve. These will help heal the outer wounds, he said, for the inner ones. He reached into his medicine bag and withdrew a small wooden figure, a carved bear. My people say bear brings courage and wisdom. She teaches us to stand strong. Lydia cradled the carving, fingers tracing its smooth lines. Thank you, she whispered. They prayed together then, Mrs. Talbot's clear voice mixing with 3 Pines' deeper tones in languages old and new. Lydia bowed her head, tears sliding silently down her cheeks as their words wrapped around her like a blanket of protection. After the prayers, 3 Pines began to speak softly, telling an old story about a small bird who outsmarted a mountain lion. His hands moved as he spoke, sketching pictures in the air, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the tale. When he described the bird's clever trick, Lydia's laugh surprised them all. A small, rusty sound, but genuine. Owen leaned against the doorframe, watching. The sight of Lydia's smile, however brief, kindled something warm in his chest. Here in his cabin, with these good people surrounding her, she looked almost at peace. The shadow of Silas's threat still loomed, but they weren't facing it alone anymore. Morning's gray brittleness had given way to afternoon gold. Through the open door, Owen could hear chickadees calling in the pines. 3 Pines' story wound to its end. Mrs. Talbot added her own gentle chuckle, and Lydia's fingers still moved over the carved bear, drawing strength from its solid presence. It wasn't a solution, not yet. But it was a beginning. A reminder that even in the hardest times, grace could find its way through the smallest cracks, like sunlight through cabin walls. Owen straightened, squaring his shoulders. They'd face whatever came next together, with truth and courage as their weapons. The morning sun cast long shadows across fresh snow as Owen stacked split logs onto his small wagon. 2 days had passed since Mrs. Talbot and 3 Pines' visit, each hour marked by watchful quiet. His woodpile had grown low, and several townspeople relied on his deliveries during the harsh mountain winters. The work couldn't wait, even with danger lurking. I won't be gone long, he assured Lydia, who stood in the doorway wrapped in a borrowed shawl. Keep the rifle close. She nodded, fingers tight on the doorframe. Be careful, Owen. The wagon creaked as Owen guided his horse down the narrow mountain track. Fresh powder crunched beneath the wheels, and his breath frosted in the cold air. Pine boughs hung heavy with snow, creating tunnels of white that would have been peaceful in other times. He was halfway to town, the trail curving around a massive granite boulder, when movement caught his eye. Owen's hand dropped to his revolver, but he wasn't fast enough. Silas Goff stepped out from behind the rock, a Winchester held with casual confidence across his chest. "Morning, Cooper," Silas drawled, positioning himself squarely in the middle of the path. His beard was flecked with gray, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. "Heard tell you've been keeping interesting company up at your place." Owen's jaw tightened. He kept his voice level, though his heart hammered. "Word sure travels fast in these parts." "That it does." Silas shifted his weight, rifle barrel catching sunlight. "Thought we ought to have us a friendly chat about that." "Nothing to chat about," Owen said firmly. Silas's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now see, I disagree. That woman you're harboring, she belongs to me, fair and square. Got the paper to prove it." "A human being can't belong to anyone," Owen countered, anger rising beneath his careful calm. "That contract ain't worth the ink it's printed with." "Law says different." Silas took a step closer, boots crunching in snow. "But I'm a reasonable man. I know taking care of a woman costs money, food, clothes, such like. So here's my offer." He reached into his coat with his free hand, pulled out a leather pouch that clinked. $200, gold. Just hand her over quiet-like. We all go our separate ways." Owen's stomach turned at the casual way Silas discussed buying and selling a person. "She's a free woman," he said through clenched teeth. "Not property to be traded." The friendly mask slipped from Silas's face. His eyes went cold as the surrounding snow. "Maybe you ain't heard how things work up here in the high country," he said softly. "Law's a long way off. Accidents happen all the time. Falls, avalanches, all sorts of misfortune. Would be a shame if anything happened to you. Or her." "That sounded mighty close to a threat," Owen said, matching Silas's quiet tone. "Just stating facts." Silas's rifle barrel shifted slightly, catching the sun again. "Marshall's already seen my contract, got his seal and everything. So you can take the money and step aside, or—" He let the sentence hang. Owen held his gaze, unflinching. "Or you can step aside and let me pass. Your choice." For a long moment, neither man moved. The only sound was wind in the pines and the nervous stamp of Owen's horse. Finally, Silas gave a short laugh and stepped back, keeping his rifle ready. "Have it your way, Cooper. But remember, I tried to be civilized about this." Owen clicked his tongue, urging his horse forward. Every muscle was tense as he passed Silas, expecting a shot between his shoulder blades. But only silence followed him down the trail. His hands shook as he made his deliveries in town. The encounter had left him deeply unsettled, not just by the threat to himself, but by the cold calculation in Silas's eyes. This was a man used to taking what he wanted, one way or another. By late afternoon, heavy clouds were rolling over the peaks, dark with the promise of snow. Owen hurried through his last delivery, eager to get back to the cabin before the storm hit. The temperature was dropping fast, and the wind had picked up, driving icy particles against his face as he rode. The cabin windows glowed with welcome lamplight when he finally arrived. Lydia had kept the fire well stoked, and the warmth wrapped around him as he stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. "You were gone longer than usual," she said, worry clear in her voice. Owen hung his coat by the door, then sank into a chair near the hearth. "Ran into Silas on the trail." Lydia went still, her face draining of color. "What happened?" "He tried to buy you from me," Owen said grimly. "Offered 200 in gold to hand you over quiet-like." "As if—" Lydia's voice cracked. She took a steadying breath. "As if I were a horse or cattle to be sold." "I told him you're a free woman," Owen said. He didn't take kindly to that. Made some threats about accidents happening in the mountains. Outside, the wind rose to a moan, rattling the cabin's shutters. The first heavy flakes of snow were visible in the lamplight beyond the windows. Lydia moved closer to the fire, wrapping her arms around herself. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. Owen stoked the fire, watching sparks rise up the chimney. "We keep living, keep working. You've been helping with the cooking, the cleaning. We don't stop that. We don't let him make us live like prisoners." Lydia nodded slowly. "I won't hide in corners anymore. Won't let fear rule me again." Her voice grew stronger. "But Owen, he's dangerous. What he wants, he takes. I've seen it." "I know." Owen met her worried gaze. "But you're not alone this time. Mrs. Talbot, 3 Pines. They're with us. And I swear to you, Lydia, I won't let him take you back, no matter what paper he waves around." The storm gathered force outside, snow falling thick and fast now. Wind whistled through the cabin's chinks, but near the fire, it was warm. Lydia sat in the chair opposite Owen, her hands clasped in her lap. "Tell me about your mother's people," Owen said after a while, wanting to draw her thoughts away from Silas. "You mentioned Apache songs that night by the fire." A ghost of a smile touched Lydia's lips. "She used to sing when she worked, grinding corn, weaving baskets. Said songs make the spirit stronger." She hummed a few notes, soft and low. This one was about rain bringing life to dry places. They talked through the evening, voices quiet beneath the storm's voice. Lydia shared fragments of memory, her mother's gentle hands, the smell of piñon smoke, the taste of fresh tortillas. Owen listened, adding logs to the fire when needed, creating a space where she could remember without fear. But even as they talked, both were aware of Silas riding back into town through the growing storm, taking a room at the boarding house where lamplight burned late into the night. He sat at a scarred wooden table, cleaning his rifle with methodical care, his mind turning over plans and possibilities. The law was on his side, or could be made to appear so. And if that failed, well, accidents did happen in the mountains. Either way, he would have what he considered his property back. The storm drove hard against the cabin walls, but inside, the fire held back the darkness. Owen and Lydia sat close to its warmth, their quiet conversation a defiance against the threats gathering like storm clouds on their horizon. They would face whatever came together, refusing to bow to fear or false claims of ownership. Outside, snow continued to fall, transforming the landscape into something alien and white. But the cabin remained a small island of warmth and light, sheltering 2 people who had chosen to stand against cruelty, whatever the cost. The snow came down without mercy. For 3 days, winter held Owen's cabin in its grip, piling drifts high against the log walls until the windows showed nothing but white. Inside, lamplight cast warm shadows as Owen added another log to the fire, careful to maintain their dwindling wood supply. "Reckon we're here for a spell," he said, brushing bark dust from his hands. "Storm's got no mind to let up." Lydia looked up from where she sat, cross-legged by the hearth, mending one of Owen's shirts. "At least we've got enough food stored," she said softly. The forced closeness might have been uncomfortable, but something had shifted between them over these snowbound days. A quiet trust had grown, like spring grass pushing through melting snow. They fell into simple rhythms. Owen tending the fire and checking his trap lines close to the cabin when the wind allowed. Lydia cooking their modest meals and keeping house. Mornings bled into afternoons, marked only by the changing light through the snow-filtered windows. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk. At first, their conversation stayed safe. Weather, chores, memories of warmer seasons. But as the storm pressed them closer, deeper truths began to surface. "Tell me more about your mother," Owen said one night as they finished a supper of beans and cornbread. "If you've a mind to share." Lydia's fingers traced patterns on her tin cup. "She was Apache, strong and gentle all at once. Used to say I had feet in two worlds, but that didn't make me less whole." She smiled faintly. "When I was little, I'd get so frustrated, trying to be perfect in both places. White folks wanted me one way, my mother's people another." "Must have been hard," Owen said quietly, "feeling torn like that." "It was. Still is, sometimes." Lydia set her cup down. "Mother taught me her ways, plants that heal, songs that strengthen the faux spirit. But she also made sure I could read English, write my letters, said knowledge was like having extra arrows in your quiver." Owen nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Wise woman, your mother." "She was." Lydia's voice grew distant. "Lost her when I was 15. After that, well, that's when things got harder. When certain men started seeing me as something to be claimed." The fire popped and crackled, filling the heavy silence that followed. Owen stared into the flames, his face troubled. Something seemed to war within him until finally he spoke. "I need to tell you something," he said roughly. "About my past. About the man who sold you." Lydia went very still, but she didn't look away. "I rode with him," Owen continued, the words coming hard. "Before, when we were Army Scouts. Watched him and others like him raid camps, heard them brag about taming the savages." His hands clenched on his knees. "I never raised my gun against your people, but I kept quiet, drew my pay, told myself it wasn't my business. Why are you telling me this now?" Lydia's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because you deserve to know the truth. Because I'm sick with shame for staying silent." Owen's voice cracked. "Because every time I look at you and think about what that man did, what they all did, I know I share the blame. My silence made me part of it." The storm howled outside, rattling the shutters. Lydia sat very quiet for a long moment, processing his words. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful despite its pain. "My mother used to say that truth is like bitter medicine. It hurts going down, but it can heal what's broken." She looked at Owen directly. "Thank you for not hiding this from me." Owen shook his head, anguished. "How can you even look at me? Knowing I rode with him, kept my mouth shut while they—" "Because you're not that man anymore," Lydia said simply. "I see who you are now, someone trying to make things right." The next evening, as the storm reached its fiercest pitch yet, Owen brought out his worn Bible. The lamplight caught the gold-leafed edges as he carefully turned the pages. "Would you mind if I read aloud?" he asked. "There's a passage that's been on my mind." Lydia nodded, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders as she settled by the fire. Owen's voice was low and steady as he read about the woman caught in adultery, how the crowd wanted to stone her, how Jesus wrote in the dust and spoke about casting the first stone, how one by one her accusers walked away until only mercy remained. When he finished reading, silence filled the cabin except for the storm's voice. "They were so quick to blame her," Lydia said at last. "So sure they knew what she deserved." Owen closed the Bible gently. "Like folks who think they can own another person's life, who twist the law to suit their cruel purposes." "Like Silas," Lydia said quietly. "Yes." Owen's hands tightened on the book. "And like me, back then, standing silent while others did wrong." His voice broke. "Do you think, is forgiveness possible for someone like that? Someone who watched evil happen and did nothing?" Lydia was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire dance. "I don't know everything about forgiveness," she said finally. "It's not simple, like fresh tracks in new snow. But I believe God can make new paths in any heart, no matter how hard packed the ground." Owen's shoulders shook as he bent his head, tears falling onto the Bible's leather cover. Lydia reached across the space between them and touched his arm, not to absolve, but to acknowledge his pain and his effort to change. They sat together as the storm raged on, sharing the warmth of the fire and the weight of truth spoken aloud. Something was shifting between them, like ice breaking up in spring, painful but necessary, making way for new growth. The next morning, the fury of the storm had finally begun to ease. Wan sunlight filtered through the snow-crusted windows, casting pearl-colored light across the cabin floor. Owen and Lydia moved through their morning tasks with a different kind of quiet, not the tense silence of secrets kept, but the peaceful understanding of two people who had seen into each other's depths and chosen to stay. Lydia hummed one of her mother's songs as she made coffee, the melody weaving with the crackle of the fire and the softening voice of the wind outside. Owen paused in his wood stacking to listen, a small smile touching his face. They were no longer just two wounded souls sharing space out of necessity. Something more had taken root during these storm-bound days, a fragile sense of family built on hard truths and careful trust. Like the tender shoots of spring, it would need protection and care to grow strong. But the seed had been planted in ground made fertile by honesty and grace. The storm was passing, but what had grown between them during its fury would remain, as lasting as the mountains themselves. Morning broke crisp and bright over the mountain, the storm's fury spent at last. Sunlight sparkled off pristine drifts that reached halfway up the cabin's windows, transforming the familiar landscape into something otherworldly. The air held that peculiar stillness that follows great storms, making even small sounds seem sharp and clear. Owen stood in the doorway, studying the brilliant expanse. "Reckon I'd better dig us out," he said, reaching for his snow shovel. "No telling how deep it's drifted against the woodpile." Lydia nodded, wrapping a shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I'll set things right inside while you work." She paused, then added with quiet determination, "We're partners in this now, aren't we?" Owen's eyes softened as he looked at her. "That we are." He set to work, muscles straining as he carved a path through the deep snow. The physical labor felt good after days of confinement, though his thoughts kept circling back to Silas and what schemes the man might be hatching in town. The sound of Lydia sweeping inside drifted out through the walls, somehow domestic and comforting. Their morning passed in steady work. Owen cleared paths to the woodpile, the stable, and the necessary house, while Lydia transformed the cabin's interior. She hummed softly as she worked, an Apache melody that seemed to float on the crystal-clear air. By early afternoon, Owen had finished the most urgent outdoor tasks. He stamped snow from his boots and came inside to find the cabin tidier than it had been in years. Lydia had swept every corner, straightened his few possessions, and somehow made the rustic space feel more like a home than a mere shelter. "I need to ride into town," he said, warming his hands by the stove. "Find out what's been stirring while we were snowed in." Lydia's hands stilled on the cloth she was folding. "Silas?" "Yes. Need to know what he's been up to." Owen checked his pistol before sliding it into his holster. "Will you be all right here alone for a few hours?" She squared her shoulders. "I'll manage. Just be careful." The trail into town was challenging but passable, with his horse picking its way carefully through the drifts. Owen's mind churned with worry as he rode. The past days with Lydia had changed something in him, awakened a protective instinct that went beyond mere duty. The thought of Silas trying to claim her made his blood run cold. As he approached town, he noticed more activity than usual around the church. Mrs. Talbot stood on the steps, speaking earnestly with 3 Pines and the ranch couple. When she spotted Owen, she hurried over to his horse. "Thank the Lord you've come," she said, her breath clouding in the cold air. "We need you inside. There's to be a meeting." Owen dismounted, following her into the church. The marshal stood near the altar, his face grave. Several town elders occupied the front pews, along with 3 Pines and the ranch couple who had followed them in. The atmosphere was tense with unspoken concern. "While you were snowed in," Mrs. Talbot explained quietly, "Silas has been making quite a stir. Spent most of the storm in the saloon, showing that contract of his to anyone who'd look. Been pressuring the marshal something fierce." The marshal cleared his throat. "That's why I called this gathering. We need to discuss the situation properly." He gestured for Owen to take a seat. Once everyone had settled, the marshal stood before them, hands clasped behind his back. "I'll be direct. Silas Goff has presented what appears to be a legal contract of ownership regarding the woman currently in Mr. Cooper's care. Under territorial law, such contracts are recognized and enforceable." A murmur of distress rippled through the small crowd. The ranch wife gripped her husband's hand. "However," Mrs. Talbot spoke up, her voice carrying clearly through the church, "we know such contracts can be falsified, and surely the law must consider the circumstances, the clear signs of abuse, the fact that Lydia fled in fear for her life." The marshal shifted uncomfortably. "The law doesn't always account for such nuances, but," he held up a hand as several people began to protest, "I am willing to send a telegram to Judge Harrison in Fort Smith, ask for his guidance in this matter." "And if the judge sides with Silas?" Owen asked, his voice tight. "Then I'll have no choice but to enforce the contract." The marshal met Owen's eyes steadily. "I don't like it any more than you do, but I took an oath to uphold the law." 3 Pines spoke then, his deep voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Law is like a river. It can bring life or death. The question is not just what the law says, but what justice requires." The ranch couple nodded emphatically. "We've seen what happens when bad men twist the law to their purpose," the husband said. "Seen too many women and children suffer for it." "Which is why we must seek proper legal guidance," the marshal insisted. "I'll send that telegram today, but until we have an answer, I expect everyone to maintain the peace. No taking matters into their own hands." He looked pointedly at Owen. The meeting continued for another hour, with various concerns and suggestions being voiced. Mrs. Talbot offered to help draft the telegram, ensuring the judge would understand the full situation. The ranch couple volunteered to keep watch for any suspicious movement on the trails near Owen's cabin. As the gathering broke up, Mrs. Talbot pulled Owen aside. "How is she?" she asked softly. "Stronger every day," Owen replied. "The storm, it gave us time to talk, really talk." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She's not just someone I'm protecting anymore. She's become family," Mrs. Talbot finished gently. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, even through blizzards." The afternoon was waning by the time Owen finished gathering supplies and headed back toward the cabin. The snow had taken on that blue cast that comes with approaching evening, and his horse's hooves made hollow sounds in the packed drifts. He was so focused on what he would tell Lydia about the meeting that he didn't notice the fresh tracks partially hidden by shadow, tracks that branched off from his own trail and curved through the trees toward his cabin. Silas Goff, having followed at a careful distance, now knew exactly where his quarry was hidden. Owen stabled his horse and carried the supplies inside, where Lydia had kept the fire burning bright and hot water ready for coffee. The cabin smelled of fresh bread. She had been baking while he was gone. "What news?" she asked, helping him shed his snow-covered coat. They sat at the table while Owen explained everything. The meeting, the marshal's decision to contact the judge, the support shown by Mrs. Talbot and the others. Lydia listened intently, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup. "So now we wait," she said finally. "Now we wait," Owen agreed. "But you're not alone in this. The whole town isn't fooled by Silas's paper." They shared a quiet supper of beans, fresh bread, and the last of their dried venison. The familiar domestic routine felt precious somehow, as if they were storing up moments of peace against whatever might come. Outside in the gathering darkness, Silas Goff crouched in the shelter of the pines, watching lamplight spill from the cabin's windows. His breath frosted in the cold air as he studied the building's layout, noting the door, the windows, the chimney's steady stream of smoke. His hand rested on his pistol as his mind worked, plotting. Inside, Owen and Lydia cleared their supper dishes, unaware of the predatory eyes marking their movements through the windows. Their conversation was soft, comfortable, the easy exchange of two people who had weathered a storm together and emerged stronger for it. But outside, danger gathered like clouds on the horizon, patient and calculating in the mountain darkness. The mountain night pressed close against the cabin windows, still and sharp with cold. Inside, the dying embers in the hearth cast weak shadows across the floorboards. Owen slept fitfully on his bunk, while Lydia rested near the warmth of the stones. A bitter scent filtered through Owen's dreams. His eyes snapped open, nostrils flaring at the acrid smell of smoke. Something was wrong. Through the cracks between the logs, an orange glow pulsed like a demon's eye. He threw off his blanket and lurched to the window, his bare feet cold against the wooden floor. Horror seized his chest. The woodshed, not 20 paces from the cabin, was engulfed in flames. Fire devoured the dry timber, sending sparks spiraling into the black sky. "Lydia!" Owen shouted, already moving towards the door. "Wake up! Fire!" She bolted upright, eyes wide with fear. Owen grabbed his gun belt, fingers fumbling with the leather as he rushed to unbolt the door. The iron bar had barely cleared its brackets when the whole door exploded inward. A massive shape hurtled through the opening, Silas Goff, his face a mask of savage triumph. He swung his rifle like a club, catching Owen across the shoulders before he could draw his pistol. Owen stumbled backward, crashing into the table as pain lanced through his upper back. "Thought you could hide her forever?" Silas snarled, advancing. "That shed made fine kindling." Lydia scrambled towards the shelf where Owen kept his spare pistol. Silas wheeled toward her, boots thundering on the floorboards. His boot connected with the weapon just as her fingers brushed it, sending it skittering under the bunk. "No!" Owen launched himself at Silas, driving his shoulder into the bigger man's chest. They crashed into the wall, sending jars of preserves shattering to the floor. Silas brought his knee up hard into Owen's stomach, driving the breath from his lungs. "You're nothing but a meddling fool," Silas spat, landing a heavy blow to Owen's jaw. "That woman is my property. Got the paper to prove it." Outside, the burning shed crackled and roared. Orange light painted the cabin's interior in hellish hues as the two men grappled. Lydia darted toward the fallen pistol, but Silas caught her ankle. She kicked free, her bare heel catching him in the face. "You little savage!" Blood trickled from Silas's nose as he lunged for her again. Owen seized him from behind, arms locked around his throat. They staggered across the cabin, crashing into walls, upending furniture. The heat from the burning shed was intense now, making the cabin's timbers groan. A sharp crack split the air like a gunshot. Owen looked up to see one of the heavy roof beams, weakened by the heat and decades of mountain winters, starting to give way. Before he could shout a warning, the massive timber broke free. The beam crashed down with terrible force. Owen tried to dodge, but not fast enough. White-hot agony exploded through his right leg as the timber pinned him to the floor. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a whoosh, leaving him gasping like a landed fish. Silas wasted no time. He grabbed Lydia's arms, twisting them behind her back as she screamed and fought. "Been tracking you for weeks," he growled in her ear. "Time to go home." "Let her go." Owen's voice was barely more than a wheeze. He clawed at the floor, trying to drag himself free, but the beam wouldn't budge. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his trapped leg. Lydia thrashed in Silas's grip, her bare feet leaving trails in the scattered flour on the floor. "Owen, please, help me!" "Can't help nobody now," Silas sneered. He produced a length of rope from his coat and bound her wrists, ignoring her struggles. "Just lie there and watch your cabin burn, Cooper. If you're lucky, someone might find you before the fire spreads." Owen's vision swam with pain and smoke. He could only watch helplessly as Silas dragged Lydia toward the door. She fought every step, twisting and kicking, but Silas was too strong. Her eyes met Owen's one last time, filled with terror and desperation, before Silas yanked her out into the night. "No! Lydia!" Owen's hoarse cry echoed in the cabin. He could hear her screaming outside, then the sound of hoofbeats as Silas forced her onto his horse. The burning shed collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a fresh wave of sparks into the sky. Through the open door, Owen caught a final glimpse of Silas's horse disappearing into the darkness. Lydia bound across the saddle. Then they were gone, leaving only the crackle of flames and the bitter taste of failure in Owen's mouth. Smoke began seeping into the cabin, making Owen cough. The beam across his leg might as well have been a mountain for all he could move it. His pistol lay just out of reach, mocking him. Outside, the fire continued its hungry dance, and somewhere in the vast night, Silas was carrying Lydia toward town, and whatever cruel fate awaited her there. "Help!" Owen shouted into the empty night, his voice breaking. "Somebody help!" But only the wind answered, whispering through the pines like a funeral dirge. The cold stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to his cries, as smoke curled around him in gray fingers. He was alone, trapped, while the woman he had sworn to protect vanished into the darkness with the monster who claimed to own her. The fires cast wild shadows on the cabin walls as Owen struggled beneath the beam, each movement bringing fresh agony. His desperate calls echoed across the empty mountainside, swallowed by the vast wilderness that suddenly seemed more hostile than ever before. Morning crept over the mountains like a hesitant ghost, filtering through the smoke-stained rafters of Owen's cabin. He lay where he had fallen, his trapped leg numb from cold and pressure, lungs burning from the smoke he had breathed through the endless night. The beam across his leg seemed to mock him, unmovable as the mountains themselves. Frost had formed on his eyelashes, and his fingers felt wooden as he pressed them against the rough floorboards. The shed's remains smoldered outside, but the cabin itself stood, saved by a merciful shift in the night wind. Small blessings, Owen thought bitterly when Lydia was gone. His gaze fell on a broken board from the collapsed table, lying just within reach. Hope stirred faintly. He stretched out, muscles protesting, and dragged the board closer. The wood was solid oak, nearly 3 feet long. It might serve as a lever. "Lord," he whispered, voice cracking, "give me strength for this." Owen wedged the board beneath the beam, gritting his teeth against the pain that shot through his leg as he shifted position. He grasped the makeshift lever with both hands and pushed down with all his remaining strength. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of wood against wood, The beam lifted a fraction of an inch. Sweat broke out on his forehead despite the cold. His arms trembled with effort, but he kept pushing. Another inch, then 2. His trapped leg screamed in protest as circulation began returning. With one final surge of desperate strength, Owen yanked his leg free and collapsed, gasping. The victory was small and painful. His right leg bore ugly bruising from ankle to knee, and putting weight on it sent waves of agony through his body. But he was alive. And while he lived, he could fight for Lydia. Owen used the wall to pull himself upright, testing his injured leg. It would bear weight, barely. He limped to the door, each step a fresh torment, and emerged into the crisp morning air. The ruins of his woodshed smoked quietly in the snow, black timbers reaching toward the pale sky like accusing fingers. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him tense, hand moving instinctively toward his missing gun belt. But the figures that appeared on the snowy road were familiar. The ranch couple, their wagon moving at a careful pace through the drifts. "Good Lord above," the ranch wife called out, seeing Owen's condition. Her husband pulled the wagon to a stop, both of them climbing down quickly. "We saw the fires glow from our place last night, but the snow was too deep to chance in the dark." "Silas Goff," Owen managed through cracked lips. "Took Lydia, set the fire as a distraction." The ranch wife's face hardened at the news, while her husband helped Owen sit on the wagon's back gate. She disappeared into the cabin, returning moments later with clean rags and a water bucket. "Your leg's in a bad way," she said, gently cleaning the worst of the bruising. "But nothing seems broken, praise be, just badly bruised and swollen." Her practiced hands wrapped the injuries in strips of cloth, each movement precise and motherly. "We need to get to town," Owen said, wincing as she tied off the bandages. "Silas will have taken her to the marshal by now." The ranch husband nodded grimly. "We'll get you there. Martha, help me get him settled in the back." They made him as comfortable as possible in the wagon bed, padding the rough boards with blankets. The ranch wife tucked extra coverings around him against the cold. Soon they were moving, each bump and jolt in the snowy road sending fresh pain through Owen's leg. As they traveled, Owen found himself praying aloud, surprising even himself with the words that came. "Lord," he whispered, "don't let me fail her again. Give me wisdom to help her proper, through truth and justice, not vengeance. Show me the path." The ranch wife, riding in back with him, squeezed his hand silently. The sun had climbed to nearly midday when they finally reached town. The wagon drew several stairs as it creaked down the main street, but Owen barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the marshal's office, where a small crowd had gathered. "It's as we feared," the ranch husband said, pulling up near the church. Word spreading fast. Silas brought Lydia in at first light, waving that contract of his and demanding the marshal enforce it. Mrs. Talbot hurried from the church steps to help Owen down from the wagon. Her usual calm demeanor showed cracks of worry around the edges. "The marshal's holding her in the jail for now," she said quietly. "Not as a prisoner," he claims, "but for safekeeping, until the judge's telegram arrives about the contract's validity." "How is she?" Owen asked, leaning heavily on a crutch the ranch husband had fashioned. "Frightened, but unharmed, physically at least. I was allowed to bring her breakfast and check on her." Mrs. Talbot's voice hardened. "That man, Silas, he stands outside the marshal's office like a cat at a mouse hole, watching everyone who comes or goes." 3 Pines appeared from around the church corner, his weathered face grave. "The marshal has called for a hearing once word comes from the judge," he said. "All interested parties will speak their piece." "Then we'll gather every scrap of truth we can find," Owen said, determination overriding his pain. Every detail about that contract, about Silas's past dealings, about the soldier who first sold her, everything. They made their way into the church, Owen's halting steps echoing in the empty sanctuary. Mrs. Talbot, 3 Pines, and the ranch couple settled into the front pew with him, their faces serious in the colored light filtering through the windows. "I'll speak to the other traders who've dealt with Silas," the ranch husband offered. "Man like that leaves a trail of bitter memories wherever he goes." "And I'll review the church records," Mrs. Talbot added. "Every marriage, sale, and contract filed in this territory passes through one church or another. If that paper of his is false, there might be evidence." 3 Pines spoke softly, his words carrying the weight of long experience. "I will speak of our laws about captives, passed down from the elders. No person can truly own another. The Great Spirit made all people free." Owen nodded, grateful for their support, but heartsick at the thought of Lydia locked away, waiting for others to decide her fate. The morning's pain and exhaustion caught up with him suddenly, and he sagged against the pew. "First, you need rest and proper tending," Mrs. Talbot said firmly, seeing his condition. "You'll do Lydia no good if you collapse. We'll take you to my house and send for the doctor." "But," Owen started to protest. "No arguments," the ranch wife cut in. "We'll keep watch and gather what we need. You sleep and heal." Owen knew they were right, though it pained him to delay. They helped him to his feet, the small group moving with quiet purpose toward the church doors. Outside, the sun hung in a crystal blue sky, doing nothing to warm the bitter cold. Somewhere behind the marshal's office walls, Lydia waited, her freedom hanging by the thin thread of a telegram and the strength of those who would speak for her. As they helped him down the church steps, Owen's prayers continued silently in his heart. Not for revenge against Silas, though the temptation burned hot. Not even primarily for Lydia's freedom, though that drove him forward. Instead, he prayed for the courage and wisdom to face whatever came next, to stand for what was right, no matter the cost. The path ahead was uncertain, but at least he no longer walked it alone. The afternoon sun filtered weakly through the church's dusty windows as Mrs. Talbot carefully laid out leather-bound ledgers and yellowed marriage registries across the wide wooden table. Owen leaned forward, ignoring his throbbing leg, as they began their search through the brittle pages. "Here," Mrs. Talbot said after an hour of careful searching, her finger resting on a cramped entry. Lydia's name, written beside the soldier's. She frowned at the document. No church witness listed, no indication of consent, just signatures from the fort commander and the soldier himself. The church door creaked open as 3 Pines entered, accompanied by 2 elderly native men. They spoke softly but firmly of Lydia's mother, of how the young Lydia had been taken, not given. Their words carried the weight of community memory. Outside, the ranch wife moved from house to house, gathering whispered stories. Women spoke in hushed tones of Silas's threats, of bruises hidden beneath sleeves. Some, hands trembling but voices steady, agreed to testify. The afternoon light was fading when the telegraph key clattered in the general store. The marshal's face grew grim as he read the judge's response. Contracts of service, even those tied to questionable marriages, would likely be upheld without clear proof of fraud. Later, Owen sat alone in the back pew, his injured leg stretched before him. Mrs. Talbot moved quietly to light a single candle at the altar, its flame flickering in the gathering darkness. One by one, the town's lamps winked out, leaving only prayers and determination to light the way toward morning's hearing. The morning sun streamed through the church windows, casting long shadows across wooden pews as townsfolk filed in quietly. They settled into their seats, faces tense with anticipation. The small church, now serving as an impromptu courtroom, felt heavy with unspoken worry. The marshal led Lydia through the side door. Though her wrists were free, 2 deputies flanked her closely. She held her head high despite her pallor, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found Owen's steadfast gaze. Near the front, Silas Goff lounged against the first pew, a satisfied smirk playing at his lips as he smoothed his wrinkled contract. The marshal cleared his throat and read the judge's telegram in a clear voice that echoed off the walls. The law requires clear evidence of fraud or duress to void such contracts, he emphasized, looking uncomfortable. Silas rose first, waving his document. "This here paper shows she came to me fair, through her husband's agreement," he declared, his voice oily with confidence. One by one, witnesses stepped forward. Mrs. Talbot presented the church records, pointing out the suspicious gaps and missing signatures. 3 pines and 2 tribal elders spoke of Lydia's mother, of a young girl stolen, not given. Their quiet dignity carried weight. Town women rose, trembling but determined, sharing whispered stories of Silas's brutality. Each testimony drew gasps and murmurs from the congregation, yet the marshal's frown deepened as he wrestled with rigid territorial law. "Even troubling contracts can bind," he said slowly, "and debts must be settled." His words fell like stones in still water. Lydia's shoulders slumped, hope dying in her eyes. A heavy silence filled the church as the marshal paused, seemingly ready to declare her still bound by law. In the back row, Owen Cooper slowly rose to his feet, determination hardening his features. Owen limped down the center aisle, his boots echoing in the hushed church. "Marshal, before you decide, I need to—" "Speak," he said, voice steady despite his pain. Turning to face the congregation, he gripped the back of a pew for support. "That soldier who sold Lydia, I knew him, rode with him. His name was Marcus Tate." Owen's words fell like stones in still water. "I took blood money and kept quiet while he bragged about raids on native camps. That silence makes me partly responsible for what happened to Lydia." He straightened his shoulders. "Any debt the law thinks she owes, put it on me instead. I offer my cabin, my horses, my trap lines, everything I own as payment. Take it all, but set her free." The marshal studied Owen's face, then looked across the gathered witnesses. After a long moment, he spoke. "Given the testimony here and this confession, I declare Silas Goff's contract void through fraud and lack of consent. As for remaining debts," he paused, "Mr. Cooper's offer covers them, but I choose not to collect. This matter is closed." With a roar, Silas launched himself at Owen, fists swinging. Owen caught the blows without reaching for his gun, wrestling Silas to the floor. They grappled until Owen pinned him, choosing restraint over revenge. "Deputies, take him," the marshal ordered. "He will answer to the territorial court." Lydia pressed her hands to her mouth, tears flowing freely as understanding dawned. She was truly, finally, free. Morning sunlight warmed the frost-crisp air as townspeople gathered around Owen's cabin. The ranch couple's wagon creaked up the path, loaded with fresh-cut timber for the damaged shed. Men worked shoulder to shoulder, replacing charred boards and strengthening the roof beam that had nearly crushed Owen. Their hammers rang out steady and sure against the mountain quiet. Inside, Lydia and Mrs. Talbot scrubbed at soot-stained walls, their arms aching but spirits light. The older woman's hymns mixed with the sound of work outside. 3 Pines sat on an old stump, his weathered hands gesturing as he guided the younger men in their repairs. Steam rose from the kettle of strong tea he brewed for tired workers. As days passed, the cabin and its inhabitants found their rhythm again. Owen's limp eased, and Lydia moved about the yard with newfound confidence, gathering herbs and tending to daily chores. Together they rode through fresh snow to Three Pines' home, where the elder offered to reach out through Cherokee networks to the Apache agency, hoping to find traces of Lydia's mother's people. "I want to stay here," Lydia told Owen that evening, her voice firm and clear. "But I need to honor my mother's blood, too." Owen nodded, understanding in his eyes. Winter's grip began to loosen. Patches of dark earth emerged beneath melting snow, and the pines swayed with warmer winds. One crystal-clear evening, Owen and Lydia climbed the gentle ridge behind their cabin. Standing together, they looked out over the valley spread below them like a patchwork quilt. "Thank you, Lord," Owen whispered, "for mercy we never earned." Lydia turned to him, her eyes bright. "You didn't just save me," she said softly. "You saw me." The setting sun painted the snow in rose and gold as they walked back toward their cabin. Lamplight glowed in the windows, beckoning them home. A new family finding its way forward together. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.